Welcome back. You're watching The Inside. The slowdown is upon us, and the question now is how to get the growth engine humming again. Are the solutions simple or complex? One man who's looked into that question closely and in relation to China is Dr. Pranab Bardhan, Professor of Economics at the University of California and author of many books and papers. He now joins me on the show. Dr. Bardhan, thank you very much for being here. In your book, Awakening Giants Feet of Clay, that you wrote about 2 years ago, you prophetically said that India faces long-term institutional and political economic issues before it could become a force to reckon with. When you look around what's happening in the country, do you feel your words have come true?
I don't claim prophetic abilities, and I think economists who claim that are bound to get into trouble. But essentially I was talking about the long term. And those who are very, gung-ho about growth, etc., they're bound to get frustrated from time to time. I think the emphasis should be on the long run rather than the short run. Short run, we have lots of difficulties, macroeconomic difficulties and other difficulties. But I think we should keep our focus on the long run, exactly the issues that you mentioned, political, economic and institutional.
So from India shining, we have gone to India sinking in a matter of a year or so. So what are the global investors trying to tell us? Is this a vote of no confidence in India?
I don't think we have reached the situation of India sinking. In fact, the West is sinking more than we are at this stage. But there are lots of problems, and foreign investors and domestic investors have confidence problems, business confidence problems, but I think it's largely short run. I expect foreign investment-wise, I expect if you take a longer view, many of the multinational companies will seek greener pastures in other countries outside the West, and India will be one of them. But one of the reasons why India will have problems in attracting enough foreign investment, foreign and domestic, is our infrastructure is so poor. And by infrastructure, I mean physical, like roads, electricity, ports, railways. But I also mean social infrastructure, which is education, health, nutrition, and things like that. Unless and until those remain, unless and until they remain, they become strong, there will always be problems in getting enough investment, domestic or foreign.
Well, the problems don't just exist, but all the macro indicators are beginning to weaken. So what, according to you, should India be doing to get back to 9% growth?
Well, first of all, I should tell you that I'm not fixed on 9% growth. And in fact, to me, if there is a growth of 9% in which the majority of the population do not share, I do not care for that 9%. Even if it's 10%, 12%, I don't care if majority of the people don't share. I want the bottom half of the Indian population, their income to grow, even if it's 5%, 6%, 7%. I'll be much more satisfied than a 10% growth rate in which the rest of the majority of the population don't share.
Inclusive growth indeed. But more immediately, industry has been demanding a cut in interest rates. How advisable or feasible do you think that is, given the inflation concerns, the government's fiscal deficit, and the need to attract foreign deposits?
Yes, the interest rates have been, raised 12, 13 times in the last 1.5 years. I personally think the main reason, of course, inflation control. I personally think inflation control in interest rate raising is only one of the instruments. And I think by now we are seeing the negative effects of interest rates. So one should move away from just interest rate raising as the way to fight inflation. And there are structural and other reasons. And of course, now I'm told that the inflation is easing somewhat, will be easing somewhat. And also it largely depends on global forces. To the extent there's a cost push inflation, interest rates cannot be the full solution. But then it goes to the fiscal deficit issue also. To the extent fiscal deficit is because of increasing investment, I'm in favor of having fiscal deficit if it helps our productive investment. But a very large part of our fiscal deficit is not investment related. A large part of it is just subsidies, handouts and grants. And unfortunately, and this is not very well known, that a very large part, in fact some estimates show it's 2/3 of our subsidies are to the relatively better off people, not to the poor. So it's not really helping the poor and it's not helping the fiscal deficit.
Right. But there's also a lot of clamor within industry for government to push some pending reform measures. But you seem to believe that reforms haven't actually reduced poverty levels or even helped growth.
Reforms have improved the conditions even of the poor. If you mean by reforms, economic reform, liberalization of trade and industrial, to the extent it has improved growth, when growth goes up, that certainly helps in poverty reduction. So in that sense, I'm in favor of reform. The thing is that at the moment our reform focus is much too narrow. It's just focused on improving the rate of growth for the large part of the economy which has benefited from the reform is the corporate sector. Yes, I want the corporate sector to benefit from the reform, but there's this huge corporate sector employs in India only about 2% of the workforce. So there is the rest of the workforce where I need reforms which will help the rest of the majority of the population, and therefore one should talk about these programs which are also, to me, part of the larger package of reform.
That brings me to China, Dr. Bardhan, because in your book, you say that China's growth was not driven so much by exports as changes in agriculture and more egalitarian distribution of land. By comparison, I think India's agriculture sector is in a mess. Does it mean till we fix it, there's no real chance of inclusive growth?
No, there's a lot of opportunities for inclusive growth in India. In fact, the programs that we are talking about is part of inclusive growth. But it's not enough just to give handouts. Important thing is to invest pro-poor investments. And education and health, to me, are pro-poor investments. Similarly, if you can do something about electricity, and that electricity sector requires a lot of reform, if we can do something about electricity, it helps the poor, because the big companies have their own power plants. The middle class have their inverters and generators. It's the poor. So if you're a poor producer, you run out, you don't have electricity. Even if you get electricity part of the time, voltage fluctuation burn out your machine, equipments. So I think for small producers, it's extremely important to have investment in power. So we should concentrate in pro-poor investments, and that includes infrastructure, of which electricity is a very important part. Roads help the poor a great deal. So it's not just airports, which are more for the middle class and the rich. Is the roads, electricity, irrigation, that part of the infrastructure, and the social infrastructure, education, health.
But Dr. Bardhan, what also disturbs me is the fact that it's not just foreign investors who are not putting money in India, but also Indian industrialists are de-risking their India strategy by investing abroad. Are India's problems graver than what they appear, or is it actually the opposite?
Neither, I would say, because I think the rates, as I mentioned before, are the same reason why foreign investors, I'm not talking about short run now, I'm talking about long run structural issues. The same problems which face foreign investors are also the ones that face domestic investors. Our infrastructure, going back, the training level of our workers, those will dissuade not just foreign investors but domestic investors. And of course our bureaucratic delays, regulatory delays, and these, even in spite of all the liberalization, at the state level we still have a great deal of controls. If you want to start a factory, you need, from the state government, you need land acquisition issue, you need electricity connection, you need water connection, you need environmental clearance, you need labor commissioners clearance, etc. And some of this environmental clearance is very important, but it has to be done quite quickly and efficiently. At the moment it takes long delays, so the investor, domestic or foreign, would like to go somewhere else if the delays go on. So it's very important to reform those.
Right. So reform is indeed the key to India's economic problems. Well, Dr. Bardhan, thank you very much for joining us on this show. With that, it's a wrap on this edition of ET Insight. We'll be back next week, but until then, don't forget to write in with your feedback and suggestions. Thanks so much for watching.